I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're battling mythical creatures and devilish demons as we rank all 12 bosses in the Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past from worst to best. If you want my thoughts on the dungeons of A Link to the Past, click the top link in the description as I've already done a video on the topic last week. The jump to the SNES really gave the Zelda team a lot to work with when it came to the development of new bosses. New tools allowed them to create actual experiences with battles that contained genuine strategy, and with the revamp of dungeon items now being useful tools outside and inside of combat, it's like night and day. Now, I am aware there are some exclusive boss fights in the Game Boy Advance version of A Link to the Past which are tied to the Four Swords game mode, but I'm only looking at the SNES version of the game, and I have no way to try the Four Swords games as it stands anyway. Maybe that'll change in the future? With that being said, all 12 bosses in A Link to the Past, ranked. Let me know your thoughts down below. At the bottom of my ranking, we have a boss that I think everybody has memories of, and whether they're fond or not is up to you. Atop the Tower of Hera, Moldorm awaits the player, racing around on their small platform like a frenzied little worm. The goal of this boss is to hit Moldorm's tail weak spot, and after enough hits, she goes down. Simple, right? Well, when the weak spot is hit, Moldorm then goes into a fast-moving frenzy, where if you're too close, she'll hit you and cause both damage and knockback. And that latter effect is deadly in this fight, as if you're knocked back too far, you can fall from the platform to the floor below, resetting the fight and forcing you to try again from square one. The developers leave a large set of healing pots on the floor below for the player to heal with, but even then, they will eventually run out. It's even worse if you're knocked into this hole in the arena, as it drops you down not one, but 2 floors. Why? Because the developers hate you. It's very much giving that one hole in the old Iron King's arena in Dark Souls 2. Soulsborne fans, you know the one. Moldorm is a test of your patience, not a test of your skill, and with the way his AI feels erratic and impossible to predict, it feels like a sense of luck, not a sense of achievement when you manage to get the win. I do have a soft spot for this boss because it gets clowned on a lot by the community, but that doesn't mean I'm willing to defend what I feel is awful game design. A boss fight should be a duel to the death, 1v1, 2 enter, 1 leaves. Not 2 enter, 1 falls, comes back, tries again, falls, comes back, tries again, etc, etc. And this isn't even the first time this game pulls this trick. And the next time it does it is extremely egregious. If there's one fight that I feel is just totally unbalanced for its place in the game, and just in general for the game itself, that would be Mothula of the Skullwoods. This is only the 3rd dungeon of the Dark World, and yet this boss throws everything and the kitchen sink at you. Mothula will fire 3 projectile ring beams in a set pattern and begin flying around the room, which is fine. Also, the arena is lined with spike traps that at intervals during the fight will begin moving around the room. Okay, I can handle that. Oh, and the floor is gonna be moving too. I'm sorry, what? The spike traps and the boss moveset is already enough to have me panicked, but the floor makes it so there's just too many moving parts to this fight. I genuinely struggle to keep up with everything going on visually. It's a sensory overload in a way that is overwhelming and unfun. This is especially frustrating as it's very easy to take damage in the arena, so if you arrive after a boss runback without anything other than full health, you're in danger, diva. And that's assuming you don't get snatched up by a wallmaster before you reach the boss door, negating your run back entirely and potentially wasting a ton of resources. If the fight took away one of the 2 arena elements, either the moving floor or the spike traps, I think it would be perfectly balanced and way more beloved by me. At least Mothula is very weak to the fire rod, this dungeon's item, so a few well-timed shots will end the fight, but because of the elements surrounding the boss itself, I just can't find the fight enjoyable. Great creature design though, and I'm glad Mothula came back for Oracle of Seasons, even if it uses the Moldorm gimmick in its boss fight. I suspect this will be my first hot take, but I think the Desert Palace's Landmolas are about as memorable as the dungeon itself, which is, if you saw my previous video, not very. I've seen a lot of praise for this fight, as you have to juggle 3 large enemies early on in the game, and if you're not careful, you can lose health very quickly. Only that's never been my experience. The Landmolas will burst from the ground at random intervals, firing rocks in either a plus direction or a cross direction, which the player has to avoid. Once you know this, it's just about positioning yourself near one of the dirt mounds and swinging that sword when they emerge. You have to hit the head to do enough damage, and while it can be a bit finicky as to whether you're positioned right to hit the boss, I didn't find it that difficult. I do like that once there's only one Landmola left, it begins shooting out rocks in all 8 directions when it emerges, making it so you're less likely to hit it. But unlike the Armos Knights, whose enraged state felt threatening, Landmola's enrage feels too subtle in a way that players might not even realize. I don't know why they didn't increase the speed potentially, that could have been fun. It's a technically sound fight, but I've always been more a fan of bosses in Zelda that force Link to utilize the tools in his arsenal over his sword. There's really not much else to add. I'm glad the Landmolas exist, but I just don't think they fit as a boss monster. At number 9, we have the boss of Misery Mire, Vitreous. Zelda and its fascination with gigantic eyes on their bosses certainly became a trope after this game, and Vitreous very much fits that mold. When you enter the room, the gelatinous eyeball creature will fire its smaller eyes in your direction, and your goal is to slay them all as quickly as possible. The danger of this fight doesn't come from these smaller eyes though, in fact they're very easy to slash to death with just simple attack spam. No, the real problem players will face is the main eye, as Vitreous follows the player around the room and will periodically fire giant lightning bolts across the screen. I didn't fully test whether sticking to the side walls of the room would help you avoid the lightning, but my best advice based on my rewatch of my footage is to just avoid the center of the room. As the lightning fans out in a cone shape, you're always going to take damage at the center. You also can't approach the boss, as the floor in the back half of the room is coated in a poisonous goo that will damage Link if he touches it. But once you've taken out the baby eyes, the big kahuna decides to bounce at you, menacingly. And this enraged state is so simple. Vitreous doesn't actually have any attacks, so simply position yourself in front of it, spam your sword, and it can't counter that. It's a shame since the first half of the fight had a lot of promise, but the second half is a complete joke. A fun idea could have been the poison goo drying up as Vitreous begins to bounce around, and where the boss lands, poison goo could form in a puddle. I'm just spitballing ideas here. But I think the design, the various shades of green, and the first half of the fight that will catch less experienced players off guard keeps it out of my bottom 3. Viewer, wait. I'm not ready for you to go to the next entry yet. My channel is getting closer and closer to my goal of reaching 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2023. Just look at how many of my viewers aren't subscribed right now. Let's rectify that. Be sure to parry that subscribe button to stay up to date on all my future content. Back to the video. And coming in just above our previous entry is the boss of the Ice Palace, Cold Stair, who has the opposite problem from our previous entry, a rather lackluster first half of the fight, and a good second half that still leaves a lot to be desired. When you drop into the boss room, you're faced with a giant eye encased in an ice cube, and your goal is to melt said cube and slay said eye. Of course you need the fire rod to do this, so you better have magic or you're not going to be able to win. This boss, in both phases, doesn't actually do anything to harm you though. In the first phase, it just sits there doing nothing, and in the second phase, it splits into 3 eyes that bounce around the room, but don't specifically aim for you. I wish they had a projectile that could make things a little more interesting. Instead, the danger from this boss fight comes from the falling ice blocks that periodically spawn above Link. When they fall, they have a chance of smashing into 4 pieces in either a cross or a plus shape, so you gotta be careful to avoid them. And in the second phase, combining these falling blocks with the movements of the boss eyes makes for a slightly more hectic time, but nothing you can't handle. Cold Stair just barely beats out our previous entry despite having a simpler fight, because in Vitreous's fight there is no way to take damage unless you forget to swing your sword in the second half, whereas Cold Stair in both phases at least has the falling ice to give some semblance of danger. I love the design, and it makes complete sense that this game's spiritual sequel, A Link Between Worlds, brought back this boss in the form of Dark Stair. Much deserved. And rounding out our trio of eye-based bosses, we have Argus, the boss of the Swamp Palace, and the spiritual successor of the Patra mini-boss from the original Legend of Zelda. Yes, that's right. They time-traveled to the future, watched my Legend of Zelda NES boss ranking video, went back in time, and then developed Argus just for me. This gigantic jellyfish is surrounded by little Argi, yes, that's their canon name, that you have to detach with your newly obtained hookshot. Once separated from their mother, you're able to harm and destroy them. But periodically, Argus will expand the Argi just like Patra and attempt to hit you with its dangerous rotations. The first phase is fairly simple, but has more movement to it than our previous bosses, and makes brilliant use of the dungeon item to great effect. Once all of the Argi are slain, Argus becomes enraged and will fly up into the air before slamming down in the last location it saw Link. Once it lands, it then begins flying around the room like the bouncing DVD logo screensaver, that's a reference the kids aren't going to understand, attempting to crash into Link. This is when you can get the damage in, and we've been training for this moment, those of us who waited patiently for the DVD logo to hit the corner of our screens perfectly. It's still a mechanically simple fight as most of the battles here are, but uses its dungeon item really well and can be overwhelming in the second half for new players. Very deserving of a 7th place finish, and so good that Argus was brought back as is for A Link Between Worlds. Starting off our top half of the list, we have the first boss of the game, the Armos Knights of the Eastern Palace. And I have to say, as far as first bosses go in Zelda games, this is one of the more mechanically interesting ones. The 6 Armos Knights start by moving around the room in a circular pattern where you have to get to the corners of the room to avoid them. They'll then move to the top half of the room and do a large sweep downwards towards Link before repeating their movements. The fun of this fight comes from the fact that you barely have any health at this point in the game, and you're being told, hey, slay 6 enemies. They're all insanely weak to the bow and arrow, which is a plus, as it encourages the use of the dungeon item to help defeat the boss, but isn't a guarantee, as you need to make sure you actually have the ammo stocked up. If this was the only part of the fight, it'd be good, but not great. However, when only one Armos Knight remains, it turns red and goes into a berserk frenzy, attempting to slam down against Link with surprising speed. And I actually found trying to hit the boss after it slams down to be pretty tricky. I think this could catch many players off guard for their first time. The Armos Knights are also reused in Ganon's tower later in the game alongside the Landmolas and the Moldorm, but they're the only ones that feel notable because in their arena, the floor is made of ice, and that trickier movement makes fighting them that little bit tougher. I love how simple this boss is, but also how they use the entire arena in their fight, and you really have to chip away at each knight to thin their numbers. It's a real power fantasy for both Link and the player. Breaking into our top 5, we have a boss that is intrinsically connected to its dungeon in a special way. It's Blind the Thief, the boss of Thieves Town. But this fight starts before you reach the boss room, as Blind disguises himself as the maiden you've come to rescue, and it's your job to get this fair lady to safety. Only safety means bombing a ceiling and letting light flood into the hideout, where the girl steps into it and reacts exactly like Ansem at the end of Kingdom Hearts 1, because Kingdom Hearts is light! Transforming into the beast Blind. And the boss fight is a classic we've seen in the past 2 games. It's a Gleeok-style fight, where after you damage the robed beast enough times, his head will fly off and begin circling the room, continuously firing fireballs until the boss is defeated. This happens twice, with Blind's 3rd form being his true face. Now, this battle technically suffers from the same issues I had with Mothula, being a ton of bullet spam from the heads that fly around the room, combined with the main body's ability to both fire fireballs and lasers on a swivel. However, I find this battle more forgiving because you don't have the blade traps or moving floors to screw you up. You can just focus on the boss and its movements. Blind is also extremely weak, taking just 3 hits per phase, meaning 9 hits overall. The main challenge comes from dodging enemy attacks, while also hitting Blind's hitbox, which is his head, because hitting the white of his body does nothing, and I definitely panicked in my fight and could have been moving around a lot more. It veers off into the insane, but if you bring healing, the glass cannon nature of Blind means you'll likely succeed more often than not, and the boss run back is pretty tame in comparison to Skull Woods. Just missing out on our top 3, we have the boss of the Palace of Darkness, the Helmosaur King. A fan favourite in the community, and I can totally see why, this behemoth fills a majority of its boss room and completely changes the game when it comes to boss fights. Up until this point, we've been fighting smaller creatures like the Landmolas, groups of enemies like the Armos Knights, or whatever the heck Moldorm was meant to be. So walking in to see a giant helmeted beast that can shoot fireballs, slice you with its tail and more, it's a big jump in quality and intimidation. The fireballs it shoots explode into smaller fireballs, which then explode into even smaller projectiles that will burst out in a specific pattern, so you're having to dodge a lot of fire to even get close to the king. Why I don't have the Helmosaur King in my top 3 is perhaps a petty reason, but it's to do with the hammer and the boss's mask. I like that you need to use the hammer to shatter the mask, revealing its weak point, but I don't like that for most of the hammer strikes, there's no feedback as to whether you hit the mask or not. You don't know if your attacks are connecting until you see that crack in the mask, which only happens after a certain amount of hits. You can also use 5 bombs as well to destroy the mask, but I wasn't aware of that during my playthrough and felt like using the dungeon item. It just feels like we could have got a flashing visual on the mask for each hit, or a different sound or effect, just to let the player know that their hammer swing was successful. In its enraged state, the Helmosaur King will attempt to charge at Link, and your goal is just to hit the shiny green weak spot on its forehead. I used my sword, but smart players, aka not me, should use arrows instead for an easier time. The second phase got me killed, but luckily I had fairies to revive me. I've got to appreciate that difficulty spike though. I just wish I understood why there were spikes in the back of the boss room. Weird aesthetic choice given I'm never gonna go back there in the fight. We've officially reached the pinnacle, the top 3 bosses in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. And with a respectable 3rd place finish, it's Agonim, the boss of Hyrule Castle and Ganon's Tower. The alter ego of Ganon, the secondary antagonist responsible for sealing away the maidens in the Dark World, and the man with a sprite that misled people for years. His battle is so important for the Zelda franchise for one major reason. Agonim started the trend of Dead Man's Volley, also known as energy tennis. This is a mechanic in games where when a boss fires a dangerous energy attack at you, you can hit it back and reflect it. While you could argue that Karok in Adventure of Link also had you reflecting attacks back at him, it was a passive effect due to the spell you were using, and not you actually swinging your sword to do so. This trope has become so widespread in gaming beyond the Legend of Zelda franchise. Most recently, I discovered a variant of it in Lies of P, the new Souls-like on the block where one boss had electricity attacks that could be reflected back at them. For Agonim, his fight is pretty simple. He can fire 2 types of projectiles, an orb or 4 smaller orbs. The large orb you can reflect back, the smaller orbs if hit burst in 4 directions and likely will hurt you. And after a set amount of attacks, he'll use a Thunder Blast in the middle of the arena, similar to Vitreous, but without the aimable effect. In his second fight, it's the same mechanics, but instead you're facing 3 versions of the boss. 2 clones, 1 real, and it becomes a game of just reflecting the attacks back at the correct boss. You can visually tell which is the true Agonim, and I kind of wish that tell wasn't so obvious, but I like that they found a genuinely good way to upgrade his fight and make it just that little bit tougher. For a purely magic-based boss, it's a lot of fun, and who doesn't love a round of tennis? To the surprise of many viewers at home, my second favorite boss in A Link to the Past is Ganon, the final fight in the game, fought in the Pyramid of Power. Now, let me make this clear. Mechanically, Ganon is the strongest boss in the game, with a definitive set of phases that makes the fight just that bit longer and more impactful than the rest of the roster. Phase 1 sees him chucking his trident around the room, phasing towards it to catch it, while you have to avoid the projectile and get your damage in. Then he'll summon a circular series of flames that circle around him, pulsing outwards before retracting, which then turn into fire keys that will home in towards you that you have to avoid. He'll repeat this attack, and the challenge is finding an opening to hurt him, as while he's firing the keys, he teleports to another part of the arena. My issue with Ganon's fight comes from the third phase onwards, as Ganon will slam down and summon a large fire keys that rotates clockwise outwards, leaving trails of fire behind, which is fun. But more annoyingly, because of that slam, the outside of the arena begins to crumble. Why is this an issue? Well, if you happen to, at any point, fall down one of the newly appeared holes, you drop to the bottom of the pyramid. You have to climb back up to the top of the pyramid, drop back down into the boss arena, and start the fight again from phase 1. It's the Moldorm effect. For the final boss? How anticlimactic is that? I'd rather just get game overed and go out swinging than losing the fight because I accidentally fell down a hole. It really halts the momentum of the battle and just sours the experience for me. If you do enough damage, the final phase begins, and it's actually a recreation of the Legend of Zelda NES's final boss. Ganon darkens the room, and you have to light 2 braziers on the bottom of the arena to reveal him. Just be careful of the knockback. As you can see from my footage, I unashamedly rewound the fight with the Nintendo Switch Online app when I got knocked into the pit. I'm just not here for that. I think it's poor game design. Future Zelda titles would just punish the player with some hearts lost, and I think the developers realize that too. It really sours what is technically a great fight, and without this little caveat, I would have Ganon as my top pick. But that's just how the cookie crumbles with me. I love the callback to Zelda 1, I love the attacks, I love the difficulty, I just really hate the cheapness of those pits. Which means by process of elimination, my favorite boss fight of A Link to the Past is the creature in charge of Turtle Rock, Trinex. A gigantic stone turtle with 3 separate heads that it uses to attack Link, I think this boss exemplifies the direction that Zelda bosses would soon be heading in. One head is red, one head is blue, and they're both of course connected to their elements of fire and ice. So you have to use the opposing element's rod that you've collected on your journey to stun each of the heads. And I didn't realize this initially and thought I was just doing damage, until I realized midway through the fight that maybe I should try hitting the stunned head with my sword. The fact that you have one head spewing ice along the ground that can hinder your movement, as well as one spewing fire breath that boxes you in with a trail of flames, it's a lot of fun having to navigate these 2 dangers. I went through all of my potions in this fight, and that's not something I always have to say. I think taking out the fire head first is the better option, so of course I naturally did the opposite. The only complaint is that you have to keep switching between your rods in the inventory, which slows the pace down, but what can you do with an SNES inventory with a couple of buttons? I love that when you defeat the 2 heads and the turtle begins to explode, you actually think you've won the fight. The explosion takes such a long time, and then you're suddenly blindsided with the 3rd head that acts as a snake, crawling along the walls and the floor to ram into you. It's fast, the larger center mass has a high chance of clipping Link, and it's a great end to the fight, as for its aggressiveness, it only takes a few hits of the fully upgraded sword to take down. A fully realized dungeon boss that really aligns with the mentality that began to show with future series bosses. Just look at bosses like Twin Rover, or even the current Gliok from Tears of the Kingdom, and then look at Trinex. You can see where the inspiration came from. A well-deserved first place finish, as long as you have the magic to fight it. And that's the video. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. The next Zelda game I'll be covering is Link's Awakening, and I will be using the Nintendo Switch remake version because I have needed an excuse to play through that game again. It's one of my favorite Zeldas, and it was the first one I ever played. So be sure to parry that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all my future content. My social links are on screen now, feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I'd recommend my Twitter or my Blue Sky if you have an account there. A massive shout out to my patrons over on Patreon, including brand new patron Woedenaz. Thank you so much for your support, it means the world. I don't have anything I can necessarily offer my patrons aside from a name in the credits and a name at the end of this video, but your support means the world. I'll see you guys next time for another video. Adios!